So, hey everyone, good to be back with you, and glad to have you here with me. Thanks, Linda, for giving us that, filling in for that prayer. And this morning I'm going to be speaking about hospitality, and I'm going to share a quick story with you that comes from Ireland. I'm going to use my best brogue. You remember when I was in Ireland, someone once told me my brogue was only half bad. So, here's a story by C.E. Murphy. Explains the difference between hospitality in the U.S. or in America and hospitality in Ireland. She says, in Ireland, you go to someone's house and they ask you if you want a cup of tea. And you say, no, thank you, you're really just fine. But then she asks you, are you sure? And you say, of course you're sure, really, you don't need a thing. But then she says, well then, I was going to get myself some coffee, so it's no trouble at all. I'd be happy to get some for you as well. And then you say, oh well, if you're going to get some for yourself, and it's no trouble, and if you don't mind that I help you in the kitchen, well then maybe I'll have a spot of tea. And then you go round and round and round with this for some time, until finally you both end up in the kitchen, you're making your tea, and you're having a fine chat together. In America, she says, someone asks you if you want a cup of tea, and you say no, and you don't get a cup of tea. That may not be entirely accurate, but it does say something about hospitality and sometimes the awkwardness we feel in social settings, and sometimes the curtness that we sometimes experience in these settings, particularly where we are today with the awkwardness that we have in these interesting times, not as able to be in social hospitable settings and parties and such. And we find ourselves in these typical encounters feeling a little more anxious maybe because are we sure that we're 6 feet apart? Are we sure that the table is 6 feet away from us? The circulation in the room is circulating enough that we're not going to be breathing someone else's air. And we might feel a little bit awkward because we're having trouble hearing the person with the mask on the other side of the counter who's having trouble hearing us with our mask on. My wife recently revealed to me that she has been having trouble hearing me, and she suddenly discovered why she can't hear me. It's because she can't see my lips moving when I'm wearing a mask. And I said, so you haven't been listening to me all the time before? Then there's this awkwardness. There's this anger that I think we're seeing out there that some people are experiencing. This outright just anger because some people are not wearing masks, and then even some people are coughing, are being aggressive toward other people, coughing on them. So there's this whole wide variety of emotions never associated with these social encounters that we're seeing now. And it's feeling more like a Jerry Springer stage where anything but hospitality is happening. So we're going to talk about hospitality and what kind of difference it can make in this time that we're in. I'm going to start with a story from the Gospel of Luke, a story about Zacchaeus, the tax collector. Yes, the wee little man who was chief tax collector, working for the Roman Empire, and a Jew who was collecting taxes from the Jew to pay the empire. And as the story goes, Jesus is coming through Jericho, and Zacchaeus, who's a short man, has to climb into a tree to see over the crowd in order to see Jesus in the distance. And suddenly he comes up closer and closer to the tree, sees Zacchaeus, calls him by name and says, Zacchaeus, come on down, we're going to go into the house and have dinner at your place. Zacchaeus scurries down the tree, runs in the house excited, and hosts Jesus to a meal. But what's interesting is meanwhile the people outside the house, the crowd outside is mumbling and grumbling amongst themselves, saying, why would he eat with a tax collector, a known sinner? Now, several things are happening in this story that are interesting. This story is contrasted with a story Jesus tells, a parable, a little bit earlier in Jericho to a crowd when he says there was a Pharisee and a tax collector. Both were praying, the Pharisee praying to God, I'm not like that tax collector, and I give to the poor, and I pray 5 times a day. And then the tax collector saying, have mercy on me, God, I'm a sinner. And in the story, Jesus says, God chooses the sinner. God has mercy upon the sinner. That doesn't necessarily say God doesn't choose the Pharisee, but he pays attention to the tax collector. So we have that contrast with what's happening with Zacchaeus. And then something even more interesting. In the story, we think Zacchaeus has changed now because of his encounter with Jesus, and so he's more generous afterwards. In reality, if you read the text, it says, Lord, I give half of what I earn to the poor. I have paid those I have cheated 4 times what I owed them. So Zacchaeus is already a generous man. And afterwards, Jesus comes out and says, salvation has come to this house. I'm going to suggest something that fits with hospitality that I think we don't really see in this story. I think we miss this point. But we do this all the time in our society. The people outside see and label and presume Zacchaeus as a one-dimensional character, a sinner, a colluder with the Roman Empire. So what they see as sinner, Jesus sees as the imago Dei, as the image of God. Jesus sees the divine spark. In other words, our biases and our prejudices and often our cultural experiences see the labels. We do this all the time to one another. The one-dimensional labels, the judgments we place upon each other when we fail to recognize just how multidimensional, how wide our stories are beyond what we see in one another. But what God sees, or what radical hospitality sees, I'm going to suggest, is the imago Dei, the image of God. So I'm going to define radical hospitality, and then I'm going to tell a couple of stories, and then I'm going to suggest two things that we can do to experience it more deeply, or to participate in creating space for radical hospitality. But the first thing is this clue to what I've discovered about this kind of anger and tension that we're experiencing in our world. I'm going to suggest anger. The opposite of anger is not joy and happiness. That's not the goal of trying to redeem anger. The opposite of anger, I suggest, is hospitality, this radical hospitality. And hopefully that will be revealed as we go through this. So let me define hospitality to you. Here's what Mr. Webster and the folks at Oxford say. Hospitality is friendly and generous reception and entertainment of guests, visitors, and strangers. That's hospitality. It's entertaining people, entertaining strangers and guests in a friendly manner. And there's a whole industry built around this for profit, right? I mean, that's what we understand as hospitality. Disney is exceptionally good at it, and others follow their role model. And there's no question that this is the way in which we see hospitality. We want to set up a nice evening for guests to come over. We see hospitality as this chance to entertain others. But there's something missing in this definition that misses the ancient understanding, the more spiritual and radical idea of what hospitality can provide and do, especially in a time like this. Krista Tippett, who is the creator and host of On Being and of an organization or a project called the Civil Conversations Project, she says hospitality is this: a bridge to all the other great virtues, but it is immediately accessible. You don't have to love or forgive or feel compassion to extend hospitality, but it's more than simply an invitation. It's the creation and inviting a trustworthy space, creating an atmosphere as much as a place, because it shapes the experience to follow, and it creates an intention and the spirit and boundaries for something to happen, what is possible. She says, when in doubt, always practice hospitality. So to get a little bit deeper idea of what hospitality is, we're going to look at the root words to hospitality. And there are two in particular that are interesting because they don't quite mean the same thing. But they're both root words. Hospice, H-O-S-P-S, which means guest. And then hospice, H-O-S-P-I-S, which means stranger. Stranger in this idea of enemy, unknown. Who is this person? Both root words to the word hospitality. It's like this two-pronged dance where hospitality is about creating a space for grace to show up in order that enemies and strangers might become friends and family as such, but also where we know friends and family are oftentimes experienced as enemies and strangers. It's this two-pronged reality that we have to allow space in order for transformation to happen. In the Old Testament law in Leviticus, the people of Israel are reminded, you shall love the stranger as yourself, for you too were once strangers in the land. So ancient understanding and practice of hospitality held strangers as honored guests in order for something special to happen. There are these two words associated with hospitality that I find interesting: host and hostage. Hostage. Both words are rooted in the word hospitality. Host, of course, means power, but it means power in the sense of the one who is the master of ceremonies, the one who has sort of created the space. But hostage has this interesting meaning where it means guest or stranger, but it even holds this meaning of kindness, as in captivating. Now we've come to take it different, as in captive. And I think we've experienced both in our own experiences of hospitality, when we've been to parties or been with friends or, one-on-one, or been in these moments that should be sort of hospitable moments, where we've experienced sometimes people as host, They invite this space where we can discover more about ourselves, where we're both honored and our stories are shared and honored. But we've also experienced parties where it feels like we're kind of being held captive, where our stories are not honored, where we're ignored, where sometimes often we're interrupted in the setting by the host because the host holds the whole event captive. We both experienced this idea of hospitality as being hosted and as being held hostage. Radical hospitality, then, is this practice of creating a space that we then let go of, that we get out of the way in order for this kind of transformation to happen, where we begin to see, where we are open enough to see that our preconceived ideas might be wrong, that something else might be happening. Here's my working definition for the virtue of radical hospitality. It's a state of mind, a way of seeing and being in the world that creates space for divine grace, that acknowledges and inspires and empowers one another's deepest connective humanity. It's a way of seeing and being in the world that creates space for divine grace to be present, to acknowledge and inspire and empower one another's deepest sense of connective humanity. In essence, hospitality creates the space for us to discover better bridges and paths towards what we've always called shalom, this idea of the kingdom of God, the beloved community that Martin Luther King spoke of, where we can experience our best selves even when that best self is nowhere apparent. There's a story that I heard recently, this podcast called Reckonings. It's hosted by Stephanie Lepp. Reckonings is this amazing podcast. I encourage you to check it out. These are stories of people whose lives have suddenly been confronted with a perspective or a viewpoint that suddenly challenges their own way of seeing themselves, where their experience has suddenly confronted their previously held ideas of who they are or who others are, and they have been forced with a kind of reckoning, a kind of seeing themselves in a new light, much in the same way that we are today as we are facing racism in our country and seeing the systemic reality that we as white people have even participated in, this kind of reckoning that we are being challenged to come to. So in this one, this story of Frank, who is a neo-Nazi, has this amazing transformation in the story that takes place because of aspects of hospitality that are offered to him. He grew up in Philadelphia, a young kid who grew up in a violent household. He grew up with a lot of bias and prejudice around him, and he himself felt more and more isolated as he got older and began to associate with others who felt the same way, angry, isolated, disconnected. And so he began to form with this group of neo-Nazis, of white supremacists. And of course, he got in a lot of trouble and eventually got into some serious trouble, legal trouble, was put in prison and sentenced to 5 years in prison. It's interesting, as he said, he tried to associate with other neo-Nazis. There's an interesting thing about neo-Nazis, about white supremacists in prison. Your whole life is based on being aggressive towards those you have scapegoated, those you hate, as those you pinpointed as bad or inferior. You can't do that in a prison setting because there's nowhere to hide. It just becomes violent upon violence. And so they pretty much hung out by themselves. And Frank's, in his story, says that he was looking for an outlet for his stress, his anxiety. At least he thought he could join in with some people that were playing sports and football and basketball. Problem was that mostly those were African-American inmates and black inmates. And of course, he had the tattoos, the swastikas, and the skinhead on his hands. And so he was ostracized. But he continued to try to insert himself into this black community so he could play sports with them. And ultimately, after being sort of abused himself and allowing that anger directed at him to be expressed, they began to let up. And a couple of them created, unintentionally maybe, subconsciously, they created that space for seeing something differently than they had previously seen. Here was this skinhead who was acting differently towards them, and now they were acting differently toward him, and that was changing his perspective of others. In time, he became good friends with several of them, and when he got out of prison, one of those fellows, one of the black inmates who was also released from prison, was helping him find a job, and said he knew of this guy who had an antique show going on, and they needed help, and so this antique dealer was willing to hire him. But he said, well, he's Jewish, right? And he's not going to hire me. I'm a former neo-Nazi, and I got the swastika and everything, and so he met the dealer, and the dealer said, listen, are you going to break my furniture? Are you going to hit me? And of course, Frank said, no, I'm just looking for a job. So he got the job. It was an amazing job. He said the day was great. He was surprised by how many people seemed to look past the stuff on his body, the tattoos and such. Because he was being friendly, carrying furniture for them, they seemed to receive that. There was this mutual exchange of hospitality that was sort of unspoken, but was there, was present, given space for something else than preconceived notions to happen. That's what hospitality does. And so by the end of the day, he had $500 in tips. And the dealer didn't just pay him $300, he gave him an extra $100 for the kind of way that he was working. He just said, you've been a great worker, such a great help. He even offered Frank a job to work for him at the end of the day after taking him home. And Frank said he was so astonished by how confrontive this reckoning was for him. It was challenging every preconceived notion he'd had about himself and about others, that he literally was humiliated, embarrassed. He was hiding his shoes, the black boots with the red laces on them. He was kind of hiding them under the front seat of the car while the guy was offering him a job, and he thanked him. And then he said the first thing he could do when he got into the apartment was to throw off those shoes, throw them in the trash can, because he realized then and there he was going to have to reconstruct who he was and what he thought of others. Hospitality can do that. This grace, this space to allow for something else to happen that sets aside our preconceived notions. That's what radical hospitality is. And when I heard Frank's story, I realized that anger, the anger he was experiencing, wasn't the emotion. It was the expression of the emotion he was hiding, or that was laying deep beneath. So I looked up the root words of anger and was surprised to see that anger, the root words are sorrow, loss, grief, disconnect, feeling disconnected, feeling broken. And when these things build up, the only way you end up expressing them without a healthy way to get them expressed or to get them to talk about them is depression or violence, right? We know that's the pattern. And so he was expressing this violence because of his emotional sense of disconnect. What is hospitality? But the opportunity to find deeper human connection, to find the spark of divinity in all of us, to see that in spite of the one-dimensional labels and ways in which we preconceive one another. So this idea of radical hospitality then requires a couple of rules that we'll get to here as we come up to wrap up kind of a conclusion. The first rule I discovered while I was doing drumming with others. I was trying to create these drum groups, and we were in camps with kids, and I had to just use trash cans and various utensils and objects, and of course everybody was just making a cacophony of noise, and it occurred to me the reason why there was such noise and no unified sort of groove or beat that everybody was finding was because everyone was focused on themselves. They were focused on their own little object, their own instrument, and the noise they were making, and not focused on the group. So the number one rule, I said from that point on, is that it's not about you or me. It's not about us individually. It's about the group. Don't think of yourself. Don't get preoccupied with your instrument. Don't worry about whether you're good or bad or spectacular. It's not about you. It's about the group. And so when people stopped focusing, when kids stopped focusing on their instrument and just started playing the way they were taught, they started hearing everybody else's instrument. And I said, rule number 2, it's not about the ultimate product. We're not worried about the end product as much as we're worried about being curious, attentive, and participating now. Pay attention to what we're doing now. Don't worry about what's supposed to happen and how it's supposed to sound. Those are 2 rules for hospitality as well. If radical hospitality is going to take place, we have to allow ourselves, number 1, to get out of the way. We create the space by getting out of the way and inviting others into that space. The way Philippians chapter 2 says, it says, don't do anything for selfish purposes, but with humility think of others as better than yourselves. Put others before yourself. Curiosity, seeking out shared story, finding these connections provide the platform, provide the space for grace to take place. So the rain in Spain takes mainly in the place. When we offer this radical hospitality, we are offering a space, an arena for transformation. When Frank talked to somebody, an interviewer later who interviewed him, she said, what do you think really made the difference? What really made the transformation happen? And he said, It was the multiple times people over my lifetime, after I'd experienced this huge confrontation, being in prison, it was the multiple ways and opportunities people saw me as something else and simply just gave me a space to be something else. And that challenged my perception of them. And over time, those built up until finally everything began to fall apart like a house of cards. All of those ideas began to fall apart until I had to say there must be something else here I'm missing. And so now Frank, it turns out, is a speaker, a national speaker for the Anti-Defamation League, and goes and speaks across the country on racism and anti-racism. These kinds of things happen because we are all participants in this greater community of the kingdom of God, this greater reality of communitas, of the kingdom of God, of what Martin Luther King said, the beloved community. We are all participants in it. So our little parts, it's not about us. It's about the space we create because we realize something greater is possible. The Imago Dei, the spark of the divinity in all of us, even in those in whom it seems so much less apparent. It is there too. Creating the space and allowing for that to happen is what radical hospitality is all about. I want to conclude this last week with John Lewis, the congressman in Georgia who spent 30 years as a congressman there, a civil rights activist, an amazing individual. He once said that essentially that when people come together and they march together in civil protest, in nonviolent civil protest, he says ultimately people can't ignore that. As people come together in one voice that acknowledges there's something missing here, that acknowledges there's something greater. He doesn't use these words, but essentially what they are creating is a space of hospitality. But it's a radical kind of hospitality that acts like a mirror. And it gives space for you to be your worst self, but ultimately to see that worst self. And that's what civil disobedience, civil resistance does as a group. It creates a mirror in which we all can see ourselves more clearly. We don't have anyone to fight against. We don't have anyone to rail against. We don't have that enemy that we thought we had. The enemy seems to be within. And we see our own selves more clearly. John Lewis said, all of humanity responds to that kind of joint, unified, civil unrest, civil protest, nonviolent civil protest. Humanity can't ignore it. It's the same kind of hospitality that we create in small settings, one with another, when we create that empty enough space, when we're out of the way, when we take ourselves out of it. It's not about us, it's about the encounter. It's about what we might learn as much. Creates space for others to learn more about themselves as well, to see the Imago Dei. The song we're going to hear, that we're going to conclude with, is song Ring the Bells. It has this wonderful line, mercy will not be rationed here. I love this line because it suggests something that hospitality is all about. Mercy and grace are this thing that we allow to happen, that reminds us that we are all part of this image of God, that this divine spark. There's no room for counterfeit love. There's no room for me over you. There's only room for this mercy to take place. So ring out the bells. Sing it loud. Join the voices together. Not a war of violence, but a war that stands up against violence. It stands up against one-dimensional perspectives and definitions. This is what radical hospitality gets to do. I hope that you've gotten some thoughts and ideas out of this. Appreciate the time together with you. In this coming week, I hope you have these opportunities to get out of the way of moments, to listen for something else, to even ask yourself the words you share and give some thought to those, but to create space for this idea of mercy and grace to take place, for this way in which transformation is invited to fill the space between us. I hope you're well. Wish you shalom, and we'll see you in a week. Bye-bye.